Mr. Chairperson. Welcome, colleagues. Welcome, Minister. It's always a pleasure to see you here at this table. You're welcome whenever you'd like to come. It's with pleasure that we have you here, Minister. As you know, climate change is real and we have to tackle climate change as it stands. What is the ultimate objective? It's to reduce pollution, reduce emissions which are polluting. Obviously, there are two approaches, and a dogmatic approach that we've been experiencing for the past 9 years and a far more pragmatic approach. Dogmatic, well, the proof is in the pudding. Last week, at the same place, at the same time, the Environment Commissioner, in response to a very clear question when he was asked whether Canada was in the process of meeting its 2030 objectives, the answer was clear, no. The Minister is contradicting this. Now, the Ethics Commissioner's report says that among G7 countries, Canada is the worst performer after 9 years of a Liberal government. Worse than that, Mr. Chair, the Minister referred to his participation in COP. I attended virtually. Just a week prior, COP released its climate indicator results, and after 9 years of this government, Canada is what? A laggard. Canada is 62nd out of 74 countries. That's the Liberal track record after 9 years of a Liberal government that's moralistic, and all it does is tax Canadians. Now, 2 weeks ago, Mr. Chairperson, at COP, the Minister referred to the possibility of not just having a first, but a third carbon tax. Was he serious, or was it a joke on his part? Because Quebecers and Canadians don't want another carbon tax. Have you finished? Or is there more that you have to say? Well, first, let me say thank you for the question, and thanks for admitting that climate change is real. I'm not sure that all your Conservative colleagues would say as much, but I'm delighted to see that you believe that it's an important issue. Now, the Environment Commissioner's report, it's important to note that the Commissioner's report refers back to the 1990s in Canada, but you're aware that our government was elected in 2015. Now, when the Environment Commissioner says that Canada is the worst performer in G7 countries, that's vis-a-vis 1996, and that's true. But if you look at the recent years, Canada is one of the best performers among G7 countries, and we can forward that report to the committee, Mr. Chairperson. Canada ranks second of all G7 countries overall. Now, you said that COP released a report and that Canada is ranked 62nd. I think I just need to put your remarks in context. It's not the Conference of Parties that submitted that report. It was the German watch organisation that submitted. You have the report right there. That organisation does not report to the United Nations. And you're also aware, Mr. Deltel, that Canada's pitiful performance in that report is due to the production of oil and gas. Therefore, unless you're telling me that the Conservative Party is promoting the reduction of the production of oil and gas to improve our ranking in terms of that report, well, I think it's high time that we look at Canada's production of oil and gas, because Canada's performance there is not crash hot. Now, if I could just share a document, a one-page document with members of the committee, I have, and it's in English only, I'm afraid.
2024 Climate Leadership Award. The following award is presented to me, Stephen Guilbeault, for leading advocacy for efforts in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So, alors, c'est un prix que le Canada...
Now, that's an award that Canada's received in 2024. And that's thanks to the efforts that all Canadians have made, along with the Canadian government. And everyone can rejoice in this. And I understand that the award was handed to me, but it's thanks to Canadians' efforts. Minister, I'm glad that you received the report, and it speaks to your level of modesty. But I asked a very specific question. At COP29, you raised the possibility of a third carbon tax, and that would have to do with shipping. Now, is that a joke? Or do you really intend to implement a third carbon tax? That's not true. I just didn't say what you just said that I said. You're aware of all the statements made by President Trump 2 days ago, 25% tariffs. Are you going to drop the idea of having a carbon tax which would hurt Canadians and our companies and businesses even more in the wake of Mr. Trump's announcements? Response. Well, you know that carbon pricing in Canada leads to annual investments to the tune of $25 billion, and that companies like Dow Chemicals or the Pathways Alliance, which is the alliance of oil sands and tar sands, the new CEO recently called on your leader to clarify his stance on carbon pricing because it jeopardizes, well, there's a lot of uncertainty given the Conservatives' position and your leader's position. It jeopardizes $25 billion of annual investments in the Canadian economy. And that is what you're depriving the Canadian economy and Canadian workers of from coast to coast to coast. Minister, earlier you referred to emissions emitted from oil in Alberta. Are you aware that the emissions intensity has dropped 15% over the past 10 years? Now, what I mean in saying that is, yes, production's on the rise because there's a high level of consumption, but it's not the production that's contributing to that rise. We're reducing emissions with our current production rates. For the same barrel of oil 10 years ago vis-a-vis today, it's 15% less polluting. Can't you acknowledge that? There have been investigations and the results of which have demonstrated major progress that we've made. Well, I gave you a little extra time. Now, if the Minister has an answer to that question, he can go ahead. We'll double-check and we can provide that figure, but emission intensity doesn't really matter. In terms of the atmosphere, what's important is how the gas and oil sector is growing. Listen, we really went over time there, and it's my...
Thank you. 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here today. Minister, the United States is threatening Canada with 25% tariffs that would cripple our economy. Will you cancel the carbon tax so our economy can be competitive? Yes or no?
Je vais dire ce que j'ai dit à votre...
Well, I'll respond by repeating what I said to your colleague earlier. Carbon pricing is responsible for $25 billion of investment nationwide annually. If we scrap that, that means scrapping $25 billion of investments, and we're just not going to do it.
Minister, according to your own department, actually, the carbon tax is going to cost our GDP $25 billion. So I don't know where you're getting your numbers from, but your own department is reporting that number.
Je serais très heureux de présenter au comité.
Listen, I'd be delighted, Mr. Chairperson, to table all the documents with the committee to substantiate what I've just said.
40% of Canada's economy is due to trade with the United States. Is it your personal opinion that the carbon tax should remain in place even if Donald Trump imposes these tariffs? Yes or no?
Bien sûr que nous allons continuer d'avancer avec...
Of course we're going to continue with the carbon tax because it creates jobs and it helps us to promote investment and reduce GHG emissions.
Continue on crippling our economy with the carbon tax, even though Donald Trump, you're not standing up for us in Canada here.
Je suis en profond désaccord avec...
I agree entirely with what you just said. Carbon pricing is important. Even the representative from Pathway Alliance is calling on your leader to demonstrate or to clarify his stance on carbon pricing because it threatens investment. Dow Chemicals and other companies, Strathcona, that invested $2 billion in a carbon capture program. There's huge investments with the cooperation of the federal government.
The government made a decision on whether it will increase the carbon tax over $170 a ton past 2030.
Pas de décision qui a été prise sur l'après 2030.
There's no decision that's been made yet until what's going to happen after 2030.
Just let him finish. Is it something you're considering?
Comme je vous l'ai dit, il y a pas...
As I said, there's no decision that's been made for what's going to occur after 2030 when it comes to carbon pricing.
Will you rule it out today?
Je vais le répéter, si vous voulez, il y a pas de...
I'll repeat, there's no decision that's been made in terms of carbon pricing for post-2030.
Minister, is it possible for Canada to meet the 2030 emissions targets without a carbon tax? Yes or no?
Ce serait...
Well, listen, theoretically, that would require investments of billions and billions of dollars, which we cannot achieve through tax measures. That has to be achieved by way of investments and so on. I don't have the figures right here, but what I can tell you is carbon pricing will help us to achieve 30% of our objectives. So you have to bear that in mind, and you'd have to replace that with other mechanisms. And sincerely,
Minister, I asked you a simple question.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Excuse me, we have a point of order.
Of course
Yeah,
you would.
the member asked a question and the minister is responding. I think a little bit of decorum.
It was
and,
a yes or no.
I don't
Chair,
believe that
it was
he's
a yes or
providing
no.
the
Yeah,
minister with adequate time to respond in a cordial manner.
I mean, we can't oblige a witness to answer yes or no. I mean, but we can ask. We can ask. Anyway, I've stopped the clock. We will now resume. Again, I find this
Mr. Chair, just on the same point of order.
fascinating. I find this discussion fascinating, but it becomes hard to follow it when everyone's talking over everyone else. But yes, Ms. Collins.
Just on the same point of order, I think if one of us asks a yes or no question and the minister understandably can't answer in a yes or no, I think it's fair for the questioner to then move on to a different question.
Of course it is. Of course it is.
I would like to make sure that it remains our time.
It's the questioner's time. They can move on to another question. But they cannot force the witness to answer yes or no. But they can go on to another question. I will resume now. I will turn the clock back on.
Minister, will you rule out raising the carbon tax over $170 a ton today for 2020?
Je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, je vais le répéter.
I said it earlier, I'll repeat it. There's no decision that's been made to date as to post-2030 when it comes to carbon pricing. No decision made thus far.
Whoops. Minister, your government gave away $8 billion to mega corporations through the Net Zero Accelerator Fund. Your government claimed this would reduce emissions. However, the Environment Commissioner revealed that over 70% of the companies received money without any commitment to reduce emissions. 70%, Minister. Since learning this, have you personally read any of these funding agreements?
Comme vous le savez, ce fonds-là, Monsieur le Président,
As you're aware, Mr. Chairperson, that fund is the responsibility of the Minister for Innovation, Science and Economic Development. I'd be delighted to ask him to send the committee the results of investments that have been made by way of the Accelerator Fund. I don't have that information right here in front of me.
In your mandate letter, it has here, support the Minister of Innovation and Science for the implementation of the Net Zero Accelerator. It is actually your responsibility to monitor emissions. So here you have an $8 billion program. Over 70% of the contracts gave no commitment to reduce emissions, and you haven't looked at the contracts. You didn't even flag. Did you even question that?
en fait, vous dites
Did you talk to the minister that was responsible?
Vous dites avec raison que c'est dans ma lettre.
Well, you said rightly that it is in my mandate letter to support the Minister for Innovation in that area. But what I and my department are doing, what I stated earlier, is that the fund and the details of the fund the bailiwick of the Minister of Innovation, who has that information at his disposal, that we'd be delighted to share with the committee. There's no issue there. Well, we can plan a meeting on that particular issue, says the Chair. Ms. Châtel, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. And
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to circle back on your comments regarding the idea of creating a new global carbon tax on international shipping, which would amount to Canadians' money being sent abroad, I guess. Well, no, I was just looking. I know you said that earlier, Minister, but I see the quote is, we are very supportive of the discussions that are helping at the International Marine Organization to put in place some kind of levy on international marine transportation. Now, in Canadian context, when you call the carbon levy here, it's the carbon tax. We all know that. So I have to assume that this is a global or international carbon tax that you are espousing here. So my question to you is, we go out and talk to our constituents. You know, we get a sense of what's going on the ground. Do you honestly believe that Canadians can afford another carbon tax right now?
What you're saying is simply not true. What I have said is that there are discussions at the International Maritime Organization, and we're part of those discussions.
Why would you be discussing if you don't plan on doing it?
There's a discussion on a number of issues at the International Maritime
Well, what do you discuss that you don't
Organization.
plan on doing that? Like, why would you have international discussions if you don't plan on acting on them? What an odd waste of time.
Well, it's a complex problem. We're looking at different. There's conversation on a number of different issues that Canada is a part of. Some of these things will take place, some won't.
Excuse me. This is disintegrating. I've stopped the clock, but we have to have one person speaking at a time, in a Q&A format. So I'm going to start up again now. I guess you had the floor, Minister, I suppose. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
En fait, ce que je disais, c'est qu'il y a plusieurs sujets de conversation.
What I was saying is that at the International Maritime Organization, there are many topics on the table and discussions, and Canada's part of those discussions. We're discussing these many issues with many stakeholders.
Okay, well, let's turn to the carbon tax we know here in Canada that exists. Like right now, I'm from Manitoba. It's cold. It's going to get colder. And when I talk to seniors, families, anybody, and they're legitimately at times in tears saying, I have to heat my home. The prices are going up. I also want to feed my kids or myself reasonably nutritious food. And they're having to make tough choices. And again, I'll go back to what I suggested to you earlier, is that when we talk to people, we're aware of the challenges that people are facing. I think you can look at GDP numbers, things like that, but when you talk to a human, you understand the challenges that they're facing, or at least I hope you do. So my question is, as a government that espouses the idea of compassion, how do you think it's reasonable to further drive people into energy poverty with a continuous increase in the carbon tax year over year? Well, as per the Environment Commissioner's report, it's not successfully hitting the targets they're aiming at.
Je suis en désaccord avec à peu près tout ce que le député vient de dire.
I agree with basically everything the member just said, Mr. Chair. The federal carbon pricing applies directly and provides more money to Canadians than what it actually costs them at the end of the day. And if the member was so concerned about the living conditions of his constituents, why did he vote down the increase in the Canada Child Benefit and in the dental plan? And why did he not want to reduce the age of eligibility?
My time, Minister.
Je trouve ça un peu difficile à comprendre, Monsieur le Président.
Minister, could I come back to the relevance of the emissions reduction targets, which is the focus of this meeting? Now, last week, one of your officials said that there are additional measures that need to be adopted to meet your emission targets. And earlier in your testimony, it seemed to be very much at odds with what we've heard you say, your parliamentary secretary say, in terms of, I'll quote the parliamentary secretary, "We are ahead of our initial 2030 target and firmly on track to meet the targets set out in our 2030 emissions reduction plan," end quote. Correct me if I'm wrong, you said we have a, quote, fair shot at meeting our 2030 targets in your opening remarks?
Mr. Chair.
How would you connect those two different statements?
Sorry, Mr. Van Coorden has a point of order.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. And I know this member is particularly fond of misinformation, but he's used that quote a couple of times out of context. And I think it's really important that if we're going to quote each other in these types of debates, that we stick to the facts.
I understand, but it's not a point of order. Okay.
You're not chairing today.
Point of order. Point of order, Mr. Just when it comes to the repetition of inaccurate information, the House of Commons procedures book actually has, in Chapter 3, talks about when inaccurate information is repeated again and again and again, that it can actually be considered unparliamentary.
I don't know if it's accurate or not. I'm trying to be honest with you.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Yes.
Thanks, and I appreciate that. I know that we're not supposed to accuse members of lying, but when they mischaracterize, especially each other's comments, and in this case it's been brought up a couple of times, there is an original...
I don't know what I mean, this is why we have a discussion, to get to the bottom of it, to find out the truth, and I'd like to keep the discussion going. If we could continue, I don't know who had the floor now. It was Mr. Leslie. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In that same Environment Commissioner's report, it talked about a failure to conduct value for money audits on your climate programs, broadly speaking, which obviously is concerning, particularly with the current green slush fund that's gridlocked Parliament and your refusal as a government to hand over the documents, the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, which we are trying to decipher through, despite our parliamentary request of this committee, very much redacted documents. Will you commit to, in the future, and ideally going backwards, having value for money audits, and in particular as it relates to the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, a actual number of emissions to be agreed upon as part of those contracts?
Évidemment, pour la
Obviously, when it comes to most of the programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we work with all partners to ensure that the objectives that are in the contracts are achieved by the businesses. There are a whole array of mechanisms we use, tax measures, direct investments, regulations. So saying that there's just one mechanism we use to reach our objectives is overly simplistic and doesn't reflect reality.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to